Okay, great, thank you. So DAOs today, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, are at a dead end, right? And what I'll talk about here in some more detail is basically some like new principles and some new like technologies and new ideas that we could start with if we have the goal of trying to figure out like how do we fix this. So like basically, like what might the next generation of DAOs that are implemented in a completely new way actually look like, right? So maybe we could start from some goals, right? So like basically, what do we need DAOs for? And I think of this as being like split up between two things, right? So you can use DAOs to run short-term projects, so like basically things that are fairly time limited, things that are fairly tightly scoped, where you do a thing and the thing gets done. And I think like these use cases are really good, and like generally things that can be done in that format should be done in that format. But if you have that, then like generally the solution is just use a multi-sig, right? Basically, like a lot of the time, like one of the big findings I think is that like 80% of the problem is communication and 20% of the problem is formal governance. And so if you can avoid having complicated formal governance, then like you just do a multi-sig and then you try to solve everything else by communication, right? So like I think this is kind of the first pass, right? But then beyond that, the other type of thing that we need DAOs for is governing resources that need some kind of long-term stability guarantee, right? So who here uses ENS? Who here would feel happy if 6 months from now ENS token holders decided that because it makes them a greater profit, suddenly, some corporation, I don't know, pick one, like a government, I don't know, the Solana Foundation, like whoever, gets the right to just reassign your name to the highest bidder. Zero raised hands, right? Okay. What if it's the Bitcoin Foundation? What if it's the Optimism Foundation? What if it's the Ethereum Foundation? Okay, see, so what we want is like you want stability guarantees, right? You want the guarantee that if you have a domain, your domain continues to be yours. We would also want other kinds of stability guarantees that are sometimes more complicated, right? So who here holds any kind of algorithmic stablecoin? Who here has a position in a DeFi protocol? Who here would just love it if some company decided that it's profitable, they could just make the Oracle value like set it to 999,999 and all your money goes to zero. Okay. So things require long-term stability guarantees. We could give some examples. So funding projects aligned with some mission is like one thing that like DAOs can get used for, right? And so we've seen Optimism retro funding. We've seen the Gitcoin DAO. We've seen like lots of major project DAOs have grants programs. And generally, if a project has a token, they generally have a goal that they want to distribute the token widely and at the same time distribute the token to people who have actually been helpful to the project. So that's like one example, right? And I think like funding is a very interesting subproblem for some reasons that I'll talk about. Like in some ways it's harder and in other ways it's easier. Then maintaining inputs to an oracle is another one, right? So if you want to have an algorithmic stablecoin, you'd want the like a USD to ETH price, or if you want the stablecoin to track something other than than USD, you would need an oracle for that. An arbitration system, so something like Kleros, even answer like resolution in a prediction market would be one example. Decisions on protocol changes, so if you have an L2 and then the L2 is upgrading its rules, and then that requires some kind of mechanism. Running a city, just to give a fun one, if we can make DAOs work, then Like a city is also a thing where people who live there want long-term stability guarantees. So lots of different things that people could potentially use DAOs for. And one of the like generators that I use for to like think about like different modes in way that some of these use cases have is this a question like are they convex or concave, right? And basically the difference between our convex and concave is basically is on average a compromise better or worse than a coin flip, right? And like actually you can there are plenty of examples that are on both sides, right? So like, like for example, if you have a building and you want to make sure that the building doesn't catch fire, and let's say you have two options. One of them is you pay like $200,000 a year for like one person over here to organize, like some the process of making sure that like things are not flammable. And then another option is you pay $200,000 a year for a person over here to organize that. Compromise would be, well, you pay each of them $100,000 a year, right? Now, and then coin flip is, well, you flip one or the other. Now, problem is, what if one of these people just turns out to just like completely disappear on you, or just knows nothing about fire, or just like does completely the wrong thing, right? Probably like giving someone only half the resources is like actually going to lead to, not the best outcome, but it's like less than half as bad as leaving the problem ignored completely, right? And like a lot of public goods funding is like that, right? Like software development also, like if they give you two choices, reduce funding to all Ethereum clients by 50%, and then the other option is coin flip between reduce it by 0% and reduce it by 100%. Like who here would choose the coin flip? Okay, none, right? Now, the other option is, well, when is coin flip better than compromise, right? And I think one example here would be art, right? So imagine, or even like you're writing a book, and or let's say you want a book to be written. And one option is that one author writes it. The other option is the other author writes it. And then a third option is, well, they have to play like rock, paper, scissors, one word at a time, right? So maybe some of you would actually want that just for the novelty value, right? But like on average, that doesn't give good books, right? It's basically, there's lots of categories of decisions where kind of if you sort of take half of everything, then like you end up getting a worse outcome, right? And like one of the general principles I think is like I think on average kind of like more things tends to be concave, so compromises tends to be better, but like convex things also exist. And generally things that are convex are things where like you need some kind of more centralized layer in the decision making, and things that are concave are things where you can just do without the centralized layer entirely. So that's one point. Now, here's one interesting issue, phase transitions. So let's say you have an algorithmic stablecoin, and let's say your algorithmic stablecoin is tracking the US dollar. And let's say at some point, the US dollar hyperinflates. Like at some point, the gold bugs are right. Inflation hits 100%, then it hits 1,000, then it hits 10 million%, and the US dollar starts totally collapsing. Chances are the users of that stablecoin would prefer the stablecoin starts doing something other than tracking an index that has become totally useless, right? And so it would actually be cool if in that extreme situation, the DAO could like basically execute on some kind of phase transition, and then while it's in the phase transition, the task actually flips from being concave to being convex. Basically, it flips from being a situation where like averaging different results is good to being one where you want to be definite about which new thing you're doing, and then you do the phase transition, and then after phase transition, you might start tracking some kind of CPI again, right? So, like sometimes, like this is, and like there are interesting historical precedents of governance mechanisms that can like flip modes, right? So in the Roman Republic, they had this thing where you could elect a dictator, and then the dictator would be a dictator for 1 year, and then famously, they actually had a pretty decent track record of like the dictators actually going home at the end, right? So you can. So like being able to flip between modes is also one of those important things, right? So the space is complex, right? The set of goals is complex. So what kind of goals do we have? I think one of our goals is high quality decision making. Another one of our goals is alignment. And you can think about alignment in a few ways. You can be aligned with token holders. You can be aligned with users. So, if you have an L2, then if your sequencer starts running sandwich attacks, that's like being aligned in the token holders, maybe in a very myopic way. It's definitely very misaligned with the users. And you can also be aligned with the mission, right? And the mission in that case would be, if we think about something like ENS, like I think we would prefer if ENS maintains a stable and high integrity name system, even if it would earn a higher profit for everyone by just like rewriting it with something else, right? So then another goal is capture and manipulation resistance, right? This is big. And in general, governance mechanisms don't last forever. And generally, like their goal, like the thing that they're targeting ends up drifting in some way. And like capture is one of those ways of talking about that. Manipulation is also one way of talking about that. So challenges of the current paradigm, right? I think I would define it in kind of like 3 categories, right? So one is decision-making overload, right? Basically, if you have too many decisions that people make, then like people get lazy and decisions end up being very low quality. Who here has like participated in a DAO and they've seen lots of proposals and they just like went click, click, click without thinking too much? Okay. Who here thinks that that experience positively contributed to governance? Okay. So that's problem 1, right? Problem 2 is re-centralization, right? Basically, if people get lazy, they decide, well, maybe 0x influencer dog is like looks like a good guy, and like his tweets are based, so let me just like give him my power, right? And then you like basically re-centralize around 0x influencer dog. And then the third thing is social games, right? Basically, I think we've seen a lot of this with quadratic funding, where there's a big incentive for projects to try to like do really loud marketing and try to like basically become part-time politicians and convince everyone that hey, like like my thing deserves a lot of money, right? So these are a couple of challenges. So here I'm going to suggest a few principles for designing governance in a way that avoids some of these issues, right? And some of these things I think are like a bit controversial because they kind of go against some previous principles, right? So one is explicit mission focus over both indefinite public good focus and over token holder value focus, right? So if you look at quadratic funding, right, this is one of those examples, right? Quadratic funding, the core idea of it was that basically was trying to emergently discover which things are public goods by saying, well, the things that people donate to are the public goods, right? Because if a bunch of different people are willing to donate to it, that means that they all benefit from it. And so, if you donate, then it's good. Then that's a signal that it's good. And if many different people donate, that's a signal that it's a public good. Now, quadratic funding is like maximally unopinionated, right? Quadratic funding inside of the mechanism does not have any kind of assumptions whatsoever beyond basically one, all participants are equal, and 2, like that actually that the participants don't have like a lot of cross relationships with each other. And that second assumption is false, and that actually creates a lot of problems, right? And so But in general, like quadratic funding, it doesn't care about open source versus closed source. It doesn't care about Ethereum versus Bitcoin. It doesn't care about Ethereum versus funding the NSA. It's basically, yeah, it's kind of maximally unopinionated, right? And the challenge is that being maximally unopinionated is like actually very capital inefficient, right? If you were the UN and you had some kind of exceptional mandate where, like, for example, imagine we have some great moment in history where we decide that we need funding to support global public goods, and at the same time we realize that, like, hey, Antarctica has a lot of resources, then like maybe there's like a global mandate to like Harburger tax auction Antarctica and then put the revenue into a quadratic funding gadget, right? And then like being maximally unopinionated and just saying we support global public goods might be the way to maximize legitimacy, right? But here, if we say, like, if you just have like $5 million and like actually, you do care about particular goals and like actually you would feel sad if your thing ended up subsidizing Twitter trolls or ended up subsidizing closed source stuff, then like you should just stick your mission into the thing, right? Second is a deliberate indirection, right? So I think like for a long time, democratic philosophy, maybe for the last couple of decades, it's had this idea that the theoretical ideal is direct democracy and indirection is just an efficiency device, like it's only there to solve the problem that people don't have attention for everything. And here I would argue that like actually like basically like more like forced indirection is a good thing for other reasons. And also pluralism. So in some cases, maximizing distance between participants and giving higher weight to agreeing votes from actors who normally disagree. So this is also different from traditional democracy that basically just does vote counting, right? So the idea is, if in this room we have, let's say, 200 people, and then let's say we're voting on the location of the next ETH Dublin, and then you have 105 people voting for one thing, 95 people voting for the other thing, but it turns out that the first 105 people are like all slavish followers of 0x influencer dog on Twitter, and that's where they get all their information, right? And then the other 95 are like actually diverse and they live in 95 different countries, right? Probably the correct answer would actually be to go with the 95, right? Because even though it's fewer people, like it actually represents more signals, right? So like trying to so the reasons for the second and the third are basically capture resistance, right? And like capture resistance can be explicit, so like bribery, multi-account ownership. It can also be implicit, like shared memes, everyone following 0x influencer dog on Twitter. So this is a two-layer design that I want to propose. Basically, imagine if you have like separation between a preference elicitation gadget whose goal is to like basically represent the mission, and then you also have a decision-making gadget. Now, the decision-making gadget can be centralized, can be decentralized, it can be pluralistic. So over here, you have like you could have like a CEO, and then you could also separately have a couple of mini CEOs for some mini initiatives. If you want, you could just have one CEO. If you want, you could get rid of the CEO, which would actually make sense for like funding, right? Because funding is one of these like very concave problems. For running an Oracle, you also don't want a CEO. The decision-making gadget is accountable to the preference elicitation layer, which basically means that you want some feedback mechanism by which, if the decision-making gadget does things that go against what the preference elicitation layer wants, then like it gets penalized or it gets removed somehow. And the preference solicitation gadget is like the the unincentivized incentivizer, and it's accountable to no one. And like it has to be because the accountability chain has to like stop somewhere. There has to be something at the top of the chain. And here, instead, we're going to say we protect it from capture by maximizing distance, right? So we say, ideally, the only thing the members in this group have is their belief in the mission, right? Ideally, they would not talk to each other and disagree with each other as much as possible on other types of issues. And so you actually get like both different perspectives, and you also minimize the risk that the preference elicitation layer starts to become like loyal to itself instead of being loyal to the mission, right? Because that's always the biggest risk. So this is like one way to like think about how to do these things. So what kinds of technologies might we use, right? So privacy and governance is one. So voting should be ZK. And longer term, there's also Macy, which basically makes your voting unprovable, which makes like bribery attacks even harder. So that's one. Technology two is AI, right? And I think the next wave of DAOs has to use AI. The next wave of governance has to use AI. I think, like at this point, anything new that does not take AI seriously will just get outcompeted by something that does. And to me, the biggest risk is basically that like we don't figure out the decentralized version of this, and people will instead use the centralized version of that. And the centralized version basically says, well, let's just like put like GPT in the middle, and then let's give GPT a prompt. So like maybe let's vote on the prompt, but generally GPT just does everything, right? And so if we do that, then like you're not actually being decentralized. So what are the benefits of AI, right? AI can resolve decision fatigue. And so the idea basically is that instead of each participant having to give a huge number of answers, or each participant having to delegate the 0x influencer dog, each participant can give like a few bits of input to a mechanism, and then that few bits of input is enough to learn their preferences, and then based off of that, like you have some other gadget that's optimizing for it, right? And like deep funding and futarchy are kind of two very natural examples of trying to do this kind of thing, right? So the way deep funding works is basically a jury answers a small number of questions that are randomly sampled, and then you have like basically anyone can use AI models to try to submit answers for everything else, for all of the other questions, and then those models get scored and get selected based on how well they conform to the jury answers on that small subset of the questions where the jury actually has to answer things. And then futarchy is basically the jury decides what the objective function is, and then the like basically decisions get made by a prediction market on the objective function, and then the accountability basically comes because the people betting on the prediction market, they eventually get either rewarded or penalized based on like whether they were right or wrong about what impact their decision would have on the objective. So one thing that you might notice is that like you are actually also introducing indirection, right? And the reason indirection is valuable here is basically like indirection can really like it can minimize like a lot of like specific capture risks, right? So with public goods funding, for example, like imagine there is one decision, and that one decision is like, hey, let's give like a Viper $500,000, and then you are one of the decision makers, and then it turns out that like, hey, actually, like Viper is your brother's project, and like you really, right? So the worst case outcome is, of course, if you as an individual have like a unilateral right to just decide whether to give the money to Viper or someone else, right? And so the next best thing is, well, we can do a median of a few different people, and that's kind of like a forcible smoothing mechanism. And then if we take this random sampling approach, then what you end up with is a system where by default, there's like a 99% chance that no human gets asked about Viper at all, and basically the AIs get asked about Viper, but then the AIs are being like held accountable probabilistically, right? So they have the incentive to be honest and like provide fair answers because in those places where they do get spots checked, they have the incentive to end up being correct, right? So basically, like the more you can smooth things out, the more you can introduce indirection, the more that you can like avoid creating clear links between a particular person and being able to make outcomes happy that give a particular person money, the better, right? And I think like you can also reinterpret a lot of existing like non-DAO governance ideas the same way. Like if you think about the concept of rule of law, right? Basically, yeah, what is rule of law not? Rule of law is not the king saying like, hey, your company has been pro-social, here's $20 million. I think your company has been being anti-social, I'm gonna fine you $20 million today, and like you keep going for every company, right? Rule of law basically says, well, step one, you create like a bunch of rules, and then and those rules are intended to be neutral, and they're intended, if the thing works, to not overfit the specific companies. And then separately, step two, you have a different process that decides, well, like which companies actually have been complying with the law, right? And so by doing that, you avoid creating like one point of decision making that basically says like, hey, I really don't like you. Your brother like beat me at chess last night, and I'm really upset over it, so I'm going to fine them $20 million, right? So interaction good, right? Basically, and I think like these kinds of things we can like essentially we can really be much more imaginative about like different principles of governance and different building blocks that we've interacted with and used for a very long time, right? And like our goal should be to combine them with some of these like newer digital technologies to try to create like the best possible designs, right? And like I think ZK and AI like both have to be center stage because ZK provides privacy, and you need privacy to prevent capture and to prevent dominance of social games. And also, you need AI because like the biggest problem is just inefficiency, right? And if you can solve inefficiency, then you can make a lot of things better, right? So I think so. Finally, the takeaway, and also a big important thing is comms, right? Governance is 20% formal decision making, 80% communication. In comms itself, it needs to facilitate alignment around the mission, filter out noise, and also avoid facilitating capture, right? And like Twitter is not good for this. So governance should happen in platforms other than Twitter. So how do we get there, right? I think step one, like burn down the legitimacy of the existing paradigm, right? So nobody getting fired for forking Compound. Step two, right? And if Ethereum can seriously consider replacing the EVM with RISC-V, then I think even Compounds should be open to replacing Compound with something more modern. We need to build a lean, easy to use open source ZK governance tech stack. And also, I think we want to look to new projects as early implementers of some of these ideas. So, thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. Sorry, I just don't get the last joke. Compound is that fucking DAOs.
Yeah, look, Compound is like one of the very first DAOs, and they just did like a very good job of making like a simple coin voting thing, and so lots of other projects are forced of it.
So I'll be brief with this, but the CDIS hack during the week, the fact that they injected a new code to stop the hack, essentially to stop the funds being moved, do you think that that's a particularly good thing or a bad thing? And as sort of a second question to that, do you think it will make institutional funds think more about investing in DeFi?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, you're talking about Sui, right? Yeah, I mean, I think it's good for them because I think, they are very far from being decentralized to the same degree that Ethereum and Bitcoin are. And I think, if you are going like less decentralized, then like you should just go all out and actually give your users the advantages of that instead of giving them a worst of both worlds, right? And so, it's... But like the situation just kind of shows like there's a very clear separation between like blockchains that are decentralized and blockchains that are not. I mean, though I do think that even on top of that, right? Like you want a like any kind of reversion mechanism to like actually be credible, right? And like there have been situations where there have been hacks over something that rollbacks over something that's like actually much more controversial, right? Like something like like if like a sandwich exploiter gets sandwiched themselves and they like lose a huge amount of money, then actually like that's not a very sympathetic actor, and like really you should just let them burn. So like you do want to like I think if you're not going to be like immutable, I think it's like it would also be good to like think more actively about like how some of those kinds of edge case decisions get made as well, right? But and like that also applies to a lot of DeFi protocols, right? Because like even if Ethereum is decentralized, a lot of like so-called DeFi protocols on top of it are not, right? And I think if you are not, then like thinking explicitly about when rollbacks will be approved is also going to be important.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
The two-layer mechanism. It's very reminiscent of the original futarchy concept by Robin Hanson, right? Have you seen anybody like where you vote on beliefs and bet on outcomes, or was it?
Yes, yeah. So I know Robin Hanson's team themselves are actually working on a futarchy right now, right? And like futarchy definitely fits into this pattern perfectly, but things other than futarchy also do, right? So I mean, deep funding is one example, but also like even traditional corporations fit into this pattern, right? If you think of the shareholders as being a preference solicitation gadget, and then the decision-making gadget as the executive, like you can think of countries as fitting into this kind of model, right? So I think it's like futarchy is like a great example of like taking that general idea and like being very explicit about it and optimizing both layers in the directions that make sense, but also like even outside of futarchy, I think it's like a good device for thinking about the right way to do these things.
Thank you for the representation. So my name is Alex from The question is, you were talking about API, but that should be used for review criteria for this stuff. The API itself has to be trained, the model has to be tuned, that's trained, and who should be in charge?
Yes, and the answer I think is it has like no single person. It has to be an open ecosystem. And like, thank you for raising this. It's a very important point, right? Which is that I like oppose DAOs where you just have one single thing and you have like one single, like basically GPT with a prompt or fork of DeepSeek or whatever that you just feed decisions into, right? So if you look at how deep funding works, for example, right, basically you have an open market where anyone can submit like a vector of values for like how much funding different projects deserve. And the vectors are so large that AI is basically the only practical way of doing it, but it's like completely open-ended which AI you use, right? And then you choose between them based on like basically like how well they get sampled or how well they score on the questions that get sampled by the jury, right? And then a futarchy is similar. Like I think, I fully expect that in mature futarchies, AIs are going to be the primary participants. I mean, I expect that happens in prediction markets even today. So what you want is like, you want to create something where the chain defines a gadget that is the rules of the game, and the chain does not enshrine one single AI as the leader. And then, but then that ecosystem, that mechanism creates very natural roles for AIs to plug themselves into. Yeah.
You mentioned Macy in the voting.
Yeah.
Test. Okay. You mentioned Macy in the voting, but no one talks about timing of implementation, ZK behind privacy for voting. And Macy exists for several years. They went through many hackathons. Now there will be Git going around with them.
Yeah.
And it will take even much more time to be kind of like a standard or implemented. Can you mention, like, for usable ZK here, how much time it takes to pull out something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if he wants to just like go like whip something up quickly, then like you basically just like fork the kind of code that gets used in Tornado, and you just like do voting for that, right? And I think there are already implementations of ZK voting based on that, right? So I think that should be like the first thing that we start with, and then once we start with, then we can upgrade the underlying technology over time.